Welcome to another episode of Outside the System. In this episode, I caught up with my friend Eric Jorgenson. Eric was previously on my other podcast, Made You Think, for his book about Naval Ravikant. Eric has also written a lot about leverage, and it's a big part about how he thinks about what to work on. You can find links to the previous episode and his writing in the show notes. We spent less time talking about his book and leverage in this episode, and more time on his work as an investor at Rolling Fund, specifically the areas where he sees opportunities to build world-changing companies by going outside the status quo. It was a really fun discussion, and we had to resist the urge to go on a million tangents along the way. As a side note, Eric has an epic, ongoing, multi-year thread on Twitter about the sandwiches he's eaten. So if you hear me reference sandwiches during the episode, that's what I'm talking about. I'll link to that in the show notes too. As always, if you find value from this episode, you can support Outside the System with Bitcoin on Fountain or any other value-for-value enabled podcast player. Let's get into the episode. Eric, good to have you on the show.
Very good to be here. Thanks, Neil.
So this is the second podcast we're actually doing together. We did one on Naval Ravikant on Made You Think. So maybe we'll spend a little bit of time on those concepts, but I know you've been working on a ton of other new things since then, so we'll spend more time on that.
Well, and you ditched Nat going solo like Timberlake. So let's go.
No, we still have Made You Think. So the group is still together. We got the separate one. We got a couple things going on.
Good.
Yeah, a lot of audio these days. But maybe the best place to start, which is kind of related to Naval Ravikant, you have this concept that you talk a ton about called leverage, basically, and you talk about it in a lot of different ways in different areas. I think the best place to start is maybe just introduce that, because from what I know of what you've worked on since, I think there's a lot of that kind of builds into the things you ended up working on later.
There's a whole chapter on it in the Naval Ravikant, but it's still kind of the least or the most underexplored concept in that book, I think. There's some chapters you're kind of like, oh, I read this chapter about accountability. I get it. But a lot of people reached out to me after the book came out and said, like, hey, where else can I read about leverage? I want to kind of keep going deeper. And I didn't have a great answer to that for them or for myself. And I felt the same way, that there was just so much more to kind of learn and explore and continue to kind of flesh out that framework and apply it to things and live it. And when you really start to sort of overlap understanding that mental model with seeing like the success stories in the world and feeling a little bit of that momentum yourself, you're kind of like, holy shit, there's a lot here. Like, let me keep pushing and keep exploring. By way of like introduction, I guess, leverage is the mental model based on like the simple machine from physics. So you can't lift 800 pounds, but if you have a 20-foot lever, all of a sudden you can. And there's all these things around us that sort of augment our effort, whether that's tools or capital or people or product. And there's a lot of the sort of success stories that you see in the world, or a lot of the things that look a little bit confusing, are the result of leverage, in the same way that sort of some of the insane like outcomes come from compounding in like the wealth and investing world. That it's just like counterintuitive, nonlinear thinking that like we are not sort of conditioned to do genetically, unless you really like get your head into it. And you have to kind of keep reminding yourself of these really counterintuitive concepts. So yeah, I just started learning a ton more about leverage and applying it and writing about it and trying to kind of figure that out. And that ended up turning into a course, but really more so it ended up totally changing how I thought about my work and my career, and has led to a lot of reprioritization in my life.
So like in what ways in particular?
I'm way less patient with basically like effort and work that doesn't compound. I guess it doesn't like make me better tomorrow than I was today. I started working on, it basically made me never want to say yes to any consulting agreement ever. So as a matter of like a very practical thing, but I have infinite patience to like spend time with you here recording a podcast, because this will reach hundreds or thousands or tens of thousands of people. It'll live on, hopefully as long as the internet lives on, and be accessible to a ton of people. And we are spending, an hour or two to create this product that is this tiny little digital clone of us that can repeat having this conversation an infinite number of times for essentially no incremental cost. And that is a huge lever, and that lever can keep getting longer. And turns out to be a great use of time compared to, even if I could sell this hour for $500, in a consulting agreement, but would never lead to a next great outcome or some other sort of serendipitous thing. It just doesn't feed into anything else. I mean, I guess that's one like tactical example, but it totally, it led me a lot of different directions. It led me to want to write another book. It led me to want to start a podcast of my own. It led me to spend a lot more time writing in blog form also. It led me to start investing much more aggressively and start a fund. So like all of really the decisions in my working life over the last year or two have come out of sort of an increased understanding of this concept of leverage and what it means and what it looks like to continuously compound leverage over 1 year or 10 years or 100 years.
And is that something that you instinctively did well or badly before, one way or the other, would you say? Because I know, before I came across your book, I had thought about some of these things just from, like Nat is, I think, one of the best that I've ever met, at least at understanding this pretty intuitively. Like I'd always kind of looked up at the things that he would do and would try to emulate some of that, but I didn't understand the concept itself, I don't think, until Novalmanac, and then prepping for the podcast that we did together. But instinctively, I'm terrible at this, right? So like my instinct goes to like, well, why would I pay someone if I could do it myself? And like that is a terrible way to think that I know now, but my instincts would still say that sometimes. We were even talking before we hit record, right? Like of the podcast clips. And I mean, in this case, I am thinking about it with leverage a little better, but I'm making them myself right now so I know what to tell somebody when I eventually outsource it. But I keep delaying the outsourcing decision because I'm like, I don't want to pay someone to do that. So instinctively, I'm terrible at it. Is it something that would you say you were good at before you started digging into this? Or is it something you learned through the process?
Yes and no, but way more no than yes. So like of the like 4 types of leverage, so that's tools, product, people, and capital. What I find in myself is what I think is true of most people is that they are really, 1 or 2 of those come very intuitively to them, and they really struggle to either act on or even recognize 1 or 2 of the others. So for me, I grew up in an entrepreneurial household. My dad was reading books about Buffett. And so like I learned about capital leverage from a relatively young age. And I still remember being like, I don't know, 5 and understanding like the basic concept of interest of being like, oh, if you have enough money, your money will make you money. So like that is very baked into me. And so I always understood, capital can beget capital. I'm not good at spending that money to buy back my own time, or wasn't intuitively good at that. I am definitely not intuitively good at using people leverage in the sense that I don't like telling other people what to do, and I don't like inconveniencing people, and I especially don't like it if I don't think that they already want to do the thing that I'm about to ask them to do. And like I'm not a particularly good manager. I can be a good recruiter. I'm not a great delegator, but I'm like working on it. And that's what I like about, Twitter and blogging and podcasting and investing is that all of these are like incredibly voluntary interactions. Like if you're not interested in the things that I tweet about, you'll unfollow me. Whereas like if I'm managing someone in a larger company, like you probably stay in that job, even if you don't like me, don't like what I'm telling you, and don't want to do the things that I'm telling you to do. And it's just these like high tension, high confrontation relationship constantly. And I don't feel like I have any of that in my life now, which is great. Tool leverage, like I'm not super good at. It's high friction for me to want to learn a new tool. And product leverage, I came kind of intuitively to me just because I had some early experiences kind of like writing and sharing and seeing the scale that comes from creating something of such high quality that other people share it and how much reach a really good piece of media can have. So product leverage and capital leverage come decently well to me. Not good at translating capital into the other forms of leverage intuitively. But as that's kind of what I try to do in the course and create tools and frameworks to force myself to see the bigger picture and more opportunities and be really shine a harsh light on areas that I'm failing to create leverage or failing to act in a high leverage way. And all of those tools I think work, for others who might be starting with different skills or intuitions than I am.
Yep. The voluntary thing you mentioned is interesting. it's not something I expected us to talk about, but I think it's like super interesting because it ties to Web3 a lot, right? I know think my one of my first exposures to like actually learning what a DAO is came through your podcast
Oh, cool.
with Index.
Nice.
And I remember listening to, because like obviously I'd heard of DAOs, and I would say I had like a 5% knowledge of what they actually are. And then that interview, it was like you guys got really deep into the specifics and how it works. And I think you had maybe been involved in one way, shape, or form. So you were talking about that experience, and it was like, oh, this is how it actually works. It's really interesting. So I guess like, how are your thoughts then on like Web3 projects and kind of how work is organized in the Web3 world generally versus sort of the corporate or even startups, right? Like startups are also organized many times in like a hierarchical structure. I guess like a venture backed startup in particular would be like that.
Yeah, I don't know. Web3 is interesting to, and DAOs in particular are interesting in that like there's all these new possibilities and there's kind of this new ideology, but we have all these habits and momentum from the previous set of ideologies and capabilities that we're like not. It's really hard to break those habits. And so a few of the DAOs that I kind of poke my head into, like Index Coop, is like, you're like, oh, this is going to be this radical new way of working. And like you go spend a few weeks doing it. And it's kind of like, there are definitely new and interesting pieces about this, but it is more similar to having a job than it is dissimilar from having a job. If you're full time on it and expecting it to be your full time income, there's still teams, there's still project leads, there's still, goals and metrics. And, the fact that you can join or quit at any time and that it's maybe a little bit more of a meritocracy or that it's pseudonymous or whatever is like, 30% different, but not 90% different from like the previous experience of having a remote job. But you can also see how it becomes, 70% different over 10 years of sort of that ideology permeating and new experiments happening and new tools and technologies. So it is, I don't know, it's a fun area to watch. And I'm very excited about Web3 conceptually, but very difficult to predict, the mix of habit and momentum and ideology and technology all sort of in this weird hurricane soup.
Yeah, because that is what it feels like a lot of the time, right? It's just like all this stuff happening, things being developed every single day, and you're just like, is this thing going to be around in 6 months or not? And not even 6 months, like what's still going to be around in 6 years? Like it's kind of hard, really, really hard to predict.
Yeah, there's no track record. There's no Lindy. Like everyone's kind of making everything up as they go. And in the absence of like a huge unknown and a critical unknown, you tend to just pull the framework. It's like, hey, we have a DAO. There's all these people who want to contribute. How do we organize them? I don't know. Well, it's really painful to have no organization. So like, let's grab the first thing that we have, which is like an org chart from a startup. And so like, you end up having something that looks a lot like an org chart from a startup, even though nominally we were trying to do something totally new. But it's just really difficult to work through those ambiguities and like do everything from first principles all the time. And then you get these like path dependent outcomes where DAOs end up starting to look a lot like startups, even though they didn't have to, because there wasn't time to go reinvent from the ground up in this new context. And then it has to just happen really slowly or not at all. And then, 50 years later, we have QWERTY keyboards. So you never really know how these things are going to unfold.
Do you think there are certain types of projects that are better suited for DAOs versus like more of a startup type approach? Or is it more like team? Because there's so many variables, right? It's like the leadership of that project can make a big difference. The like specific type of task they're trying to solve for or do makes a big difference. Like, have you just noticed any differences or any things where like DAOs work better or don't work better?
I don't know that I have a great answer to this. I think in generally there's probably an interesting like idea to unpack and post to write here about the trade-offs between like the size of the organization, the clarity of the vision, and like I don't know if there's another axis, but like a few people can operate pretty well without a super, super clear vision as long as they're all sort of headed in the right direction. But like the more people you get, you have to get really, really clear on goals and parameters and operating expectations before you can harness all that horsepower, right? Like, so I don't know that I don't think I have a great answer to that yet. But it is an interesting thing to see. investment DAOs maybe seem like the most advanced in this stage. Like it is a little easier to say like, hey, our goal is to allocate capital meritocratically and earn more capital on this. Like that is a much clearer vision than to say, hey, we want to solve this problem or start this, build a product or something like that. There's just so many more decisions that enter into that and so much more ambiguity involved in building a product or a roadmap or solving a customer problem than there is in make this treasury bigger, you know?
Right. Yeah, I'd explored a concept around like so I've obviously the work with the corporate innovation and stuff, and I did a couple blog posts around corporate innovation DAOs and had a lot of interesting conversation with people. Basically, like how do you run this as a separate? I mean, there's a lot of actually corporate innovation functions that are already separate from the corporate function. Like they might be owned, but they don't have any management reporting responsibilities, or sometimes they're only partially owned, or they're a separate investment fund. Like there are structures that already exist pre Web3 that kind of separate the two. But I just kind of did like a thought experiment. So I've had tons of really good conversations with people, but nobody has pulled the trigger yet on actually wanting to do it because there are actual it's not a silver bullet, I guess is what I'm trying to say, right? It's like when you first start looking at it, it's like, oh wow, this is like such a great new way of organizing human behavior. And then you really get into the details and you're like, yeah, there are definite things that it improves, but it's not like it's a cure all and solves all the problems, and actually creates potentially some new problems as well. Which I mean, I think like that's why I was asking the question, because I think like it'll end up being maybe a little more situational. Like certain things, it might make complete sense to go with a DAO, and then other things, it might be like, no, that's actually more of a traditional startup.
Yeah. I remember writing a post trying to unpack this. It's not obvious what order of magnitude of an impact. Like I think DAOs will take some market share, quote unquote, from companies or corporations, but it's not, it might be a tenth of a percent or a percent or 10%. It's unlikely to be 100%, but kind of where it settles is going to be a really interesting thing over, a 10-year time horizon versus a 100-year time horizon, and how those things fit together. Yeah, very interesting question. But like a lot of unknowns,
A ton, a
Yeah.
ton. Yeah, and it's still like this is such a crypto thing to say, but it's like it's so early. Well, the reason I say that is like, I mean, I feel like you're probably similar. Like I'm in multiple bubbles. My Twitter bubble is like super crypto heavy, so to me it feels like everyone's talking about stepping, right? Like as a thing. And then talk to my friends who are not involved in crypto at all, and I mention it to them and they think I'm crazy for doing this thing. Like like it's like the most insane thing they've ever heard of, and they've never heard of it. And to me, I'm like, everyone's talking about it. How have you not heard of this? But we're in such bubbles, and the percentage of people that are in Web3 is still incredibly small, I think, compared to the broader world.
Yeah, the bubble. There's the bubble for sure, and then there's the fact that just because people have heard of Bitcoin and Ethereum, or even just Bitcoin, really, like people have the impression that because it's the knowledge is mainstream, that the innovation is like known but hasn't taken hold, and it's just a slower process than that, right? Like these things take decades to actually fully get fleshed out and have the iterations between regulation and management and building and recruiting and investment, and like there's a few books that are kind of outline this pattern that is a somewhat of a repeatable pattern that happened through the electrification of America, and then the proliferation of the internet, and then the proliferation of mobile globally, and like blockchain is another one of those things that and it is truly like so massively early. I think the last time I like did napkin math on this, there was somewhere on the order of like 10 million wallets, and there's like 5 billion internet users. So there's like at least 200x and probably more to go.
And many of those wallets are probably the same people.
Yeah, the wallets are the same people. They're not high utility. Yeah, and if you internalize like, hey, blockchain is going to be a thing, and everyone's going to have a wallet in the same way that they have an email address and maybe multiple email addresses, and maybe even more wallets than they have email addresses, then it's not hard to say, hey, this is going to be a really exciting space, and it's going to take 20 years for it all to unfold. And, it probably deserves some of my attention and some of my capital. But like, it is wrong to scoff at it because it is truly so early. And even though it's very rational to say like, it's overhyped. It's like, yeah, it's maybe overhyped. Like the hype may be above the reality today.
In the
But
local.
there's in the local, but there is enough momentum to be certain that, the hype will oscillate just like the reality will progress. And sometimes it'll be above and sometimes it'll be below. But as long as the reality is progressing, sort of the underlying confidence that you can have in it as a movement and the attention that it deserves, and the ability for it to change your life is still there. I'm excited to just kind of see it all unfold. I think we were worried there wouldn't be a next revolution in the internet, and it's here, and we get to live through it again, and that's exciting.
Yeah, it's a good time to be around. There's actually an excellent segue to the next thing I wanted to talk about, which was your new fund. I know what a rolling fund is, but maybe introduce that as well. But like the name, and then honestly, I love how you guys write like human beings on the website. Like it's beautiful. It's not like a normal VC type website.
Yeah, we could not be taking ourselves less seriously, which does not mean that we will not be good stewards of your capital. We promise, but hopefully it means we'll just be fun to work with while we do what we do. Yeah, I mean, like this came about. I don't know. I guess there's a bunch of seeds that led to this. There are three partners in the fund: me, Bo, and Al. Bo was the founder of Zarly, so I've been working with him for 10 years. He's made a ton of angel investments and founded 3 or 4 companies and raised a bunch of money and been on a bunch of boards. And we started kind of investing together. And then a few years ago, I met Al, and he's also like great founder, great angel investor. He built a e-commerce company worth a couple $100 million and starting on another startup now. And he's invested in 50 companies and done really well in that as well. But it's all three of us were kind of just doing our own personal investing and our own money, and for long enough to be like, oh, like I think we're good at this. I think we're better at it when we share deals and like kind of help each other along and diligent stuff. Bo and I are a little deeper in crypto than Al. Al is very well networked in sort of the e-commerce world, just because that's where he's lived for so long. And just, we all have different networks. We're all slightly different ages, but like get along and have fun together. So I think we're sort of compatible and synergistic at the same time. And then, I think I was at Capital Camp, which is this event in Columbia, Missouri, with Al, and we were just like talking about our investments. And I was like, yeah, I'm thinking about like how, what is the next step there? Like, how do we scale that up? It's not that satisfying to write like a $10,000 check to a founder. It'd be much better to write 50 or 100 or $200,000 checks to founders. Yeah, because they're trying to raise a $2 million round, and they're like, it's literally barely worth, the 2 hours it took to talk to you and send you the deck and do all this paperwork.
The $10,000 check they take because they want they want your attention on the company, but not like the capital part isn't really that impactful for a company raising a $2 million round.
And it's meaningful to me, as an investor.
Yep.
But yeah, like I understand from the founder's perspective that it is better to work with fewer people who can allocate more money and be as helpful, ideally. So that was one component. The other is, the more I started writing about some of these angel deals that I've done, like Density and Triple Blind, and I try to be intellectually honest about what I think at the time that I make the investment. Startup investing is risky and uncertain, and you're never sure, but you want to see a path to 100x return. You want every investment to be a potential returner of the entire fund. You want to invest in like future monopolies. And so you have to kind of look at this like tiny little snowflake and see how can this turn into an enormous snowball over 10 or 20 years, which is also counterintuitive because it's very easy to come up with a long list of very viable reasons why that company will fail. And everything that you look at maybe has an 80 or 90% probability of failure, but the expected value of the 2% case where they become, a future monopoly with the only combination of sort of like technology and market and distribution where they can capitalize on a, $1 billion a year market is still pretty fucking high. And, the expected value of that might be worth $50 million, and you're putting in money at a $5 million valuation. And like you do that enough times and that's wonderful. But you need to do it a bunch of times. So the fund helps the entrepreneurs receive more checks. A fund provides access. So as I'm writing these essays, these people are reaching out. They're like, how can I, get into deals like that. I live in Germany. Well, you're gonna have a hard time meeting this founder in Kansas City or Austin or Nashville or whatever who's founding this next incredible company. But if you pile in some money with us, we'll make sure that your money gets into the right hands and into some of these exciting companies. Especially, tech is increasingly sort of geographically agnostic, but there is something to the fact that there are higher odds that a US company can win a global market than the reverse. There are stories like Skype getting founded in Estonia. I think it was Estonia, certainly like Eastern Europe somewhere.
Yeah, somewhere. I think Sweden, Estonia, one of those places.
Yeah,
one of the places
and
up in.
I think Spotify coming from Sweden. So
Spotify is Sweden. Yeah.
Okay. There are like those stories, but the overwhelming majority of like global tech monopolies originated in the US. And so there is meaningful sort of benefit to investing in the companies that if they win in the US can win in the world. And when there's one winner for a market, that is an important dynamic. So yeah, all this stuff sort of like came together and we were like, I don't know, we're having a great time. We're investing, we're doing well with our own money and our own skin in the game. We have people who are kind of like, hey, can I give you money? And it aligned with what I wanted to do, which was to continue to kind of like learn about new technologies, hang out with founders, understand this beautiful, bright future that we have with the right combination of, applied science and entrepreneurship and distribution. And I fundamentally believe that technologies make people's lives better, and that's been the primary source of improvement of life extension and quality of life and the reduction of poverty. And that early stage tech investing is actually where all of those things come together. It's where technology and science and entrepreneurship all and capital really like all mesh in this primordial ooze from which like life-changing things come and get distributed, and that's where they're born. And I just feel really good about swimming around in that ooze and contributing, my brain and my audience and my capital, and being a good steward of other people who want to kind of share that vision and have that impact and have a good outcome if we're right about, the things that we want to push on and the outcomes that we want to see.
Yeah, it makes complete sense. And I really like the request for startups section you guys have on the site. So one of the main audiences for this particular show is basically people building. So I definitely want to make sure we get into some of these that you talk about here. I mean, before we get into the specific ones, it's super wide ranging, which I think reflects your interests, just given as a listener of your podcast and then avid follower of yours on Twitter. I mean, the only thing missing from here is like sandwich tech. That's like the only thing that I'm missing from this list.
If I saw autonomous sandwich assembly, I'd go in on that.
Yeah. All right. If anyone's building that, you got an investor. But yeah, okay. So on a more serious note, the first one is death tech. Going from sandwiches to death. Wow, what a transition.
High highs and low lows. That's what we do. Bring them high to bring them low. Yeah.
But it is like that is definitely an area which, I know you and we've had previous conversations just given life events. That's definitely an area where I feel like there hasn't been a lot of, especially like innovation and then investment even. But yeah, talk maybe a little bit more about what you guys were thinking on that one.
You and I and many others of our generation are starting to have some highly unfortunate, tragic life experiences that bring us in close brush with this market. And it's just obvious that nobody wants to work on it or has wanted to work on it. And nobody with an inkling of software skill has come within 1,000 miles of this space in a long time. So there's a lot of opportunity here. I went through some of these over the last couple of years, and the tools that you use are terrible or non-existent. And you just sit there thinking there's got to be better ways to do this. It's a hard space to innovate in. It's a very difficult product to sell. Distribution is challenging. You got multiple customers. Like the customer of the product isn't the consumer of the product. And you've got to get alignment on multiple things. And the data is really sensitive and the timelines are really long. So it is a gnarly, messy space. It is very difficult to win in. And I know that there are a long trail of well-intentioned pioneers who had just not made it very far down this road, but it's not impossible. And I do not mind keeping an eye out for people who have a unique sort of take on this market. And I've seen a few already that are very clever, well-researched takes that have kind of unique distribution. They have a really tight handle on the problem, or they have a very unique niche. Custody and transition of digital assets in particular is a really interesting piece of it. I won't drop specific names here, but like I could talk in generalities of like that's one of the niches, and we're just seeing some wonderful deals much sooner than I thought we would actually, and in this space in particular that I think are clever and have pretty high odds of success. And again, like not a crowded space and huge markets.
Death tech in general is difficult, but then you add on digital assets, but then you even add on like the Web3 component too, with like you're starting to talk about keys and all sorts of stuff like that. I mean, then it gets even more. I mean, because I'm not old, you're not old, but I'm sure we've all had those thoughts about our keys. Like, what happens to them, right? Like,
and this is the point of
you have a backup plan.
The point between customer and consumer, right? Like, I might want to leave all my crypto stuff in certain context, but like I can't count on my partner or kids to know how to do it in the crypto way, or who's going to be a trustworthy steward of that, or like if they don't care, then that's a really like a lot of value just evaporates or gets lost or gets stolen, or and it's a very difficult thing. And I promise the existing legal and estate system is nowhere near coming up with a reasonable solution for that. The closest thing is basically like, yeah, just give your private key to your lawyer, and like no,
but now you have a centralization risk.
Yeah, like definitely no.
Yeah, I mean that's a really interesting area, and I guess whoever solves that problem is going to make a killing. Okay, so next one, Web3 YouTube. I like that a lot. I feel like YouTube is almost pushing people into whatever becomes Web3 YouTube.
I mean, a 50% take rate is pretty greedy. I think we'll see over and over again like Web3 versions with low take rates that just come in with like a 3% or a 5% and just clean up. And it'll start with a niche, like crypto creators or education or something like that. But it'll just kind of keep growing and growing. And you can totally imagine, I can't remember, I think I wrote up like a product spec for this because I was thinking about building this. And I think it may be too early. I don't know for sure. But the Web3 YouTube is an interesting one because it's basically some piece of it has to be centralized. Like video files are too big to store in a decentralized way. So you have to have a centralized aspect there. So it's more likely to end up company than DAO, whereas like decentralized Twitter could maybe more reasonably just end up as a service. But Web3 YouTube should have a good rake. And you can totally imagine just like signing in with a wallet, and then each video that you want to watch has like a sort of a different revenue model. People might give a video away for free, or have it choose to be ad based the way it is today. Or they could say, hey, the first 10 minutes of this video is free and the last 5 minutes are $1 or 0.001 ETH. Or they could say every minute of this video is 0.0001 ETH, and you watch it as long as you want. You could stream, per minute of movie that you watch. You could get paid that way. Or you could have a DRM thing where it's like, I'm going to pay $10, but I'm going to own this, movie or clip or video forever and have my own rights to it. Or I'm going to remix this video, but I'm going to share half the revenue back to the original. Like there are all of these attributions and different revenue models that we can do when you actually have a wallet attached to your account inherently. And it can be much more private. And the creators on a Web3 YouTube they're much less likely to get disintermediated, right? Mr. Beast has, I don't know, however many millions of followers, but if YouTube decided to fuck him tomorrow, they could. And I hope he's got an email list, but he'd still probably lose some people. And a true Web3 YouTube would allow audience export, and they would basically like be maximally open with that data because they know they can't hold on to it, but they earn this sort of their share of the revenue automatically through these streaming fees, through hosting, and through maybe virality, and maybe helping them grow. The revenue model will be a little different. It may end up being a smaller company than YouTube in market cap, but it will create a much larger creator ecosystem. And I think that's sort of the trend we'll see with more of these crypto services.
Yeah, there's one I saw, or I only actually heard of through one of my other guests from Oscar Mary from Fountain. he mentioned something called Stacker News, which I don't know if you've heard of, but it's kind of like Hacker News, but basically it's built on Lightning. You have to put up one sat, which is nothing, right? But you have to put up one sat to post. So it kind of, and funny thing is, like, Satoshi talked about this way back in like his forum posts, which is wild. But basically using this as like a way to combat spam. So like you can't just post for free, right? You put up one sat to post, and then upvotes are, you get, basically you can accrue value based on upvotes. So if like 50 people upvote my post, I get 50 sats for that. Like I get paid for putting up quality content, essentially.
Yeah, this looks exactly Stacker.news. Looks exactly like a black and yellow version of Hacker News.
Yep, but it's like the same thing you just mentioned with the YouTube thing, right? It's like tied to a wallet. There's like it's kind of an alternative, model to just like driving page views. It's like you actually have to write good posts to accrue value. Like I like this Web3 media concept really like a lot. I don't think we've seen the perfect implementation of it yet anywhere, but I like it because it sort of allows value to flow in a much more direct way than I think like the Web2 world does, where it's like, I'm the audience, you're the creator, and then the revenue model is this third-party advertiser who's basically trying to buy like a little bit of my attention because of you. It's almost like being like the parasite along the way, right? Not saying all advertisers are parasites, because that's not true, but like it's just like that is sort of the model. And then Web3 is more, it's not done yet, but the idea is that, hey, it's like I'm getting value as the listener or you're getting value as the creator, and how do we kind of do that thing directly without this third party being involved?
100%. I don't know if you know Sky King. He's a buddy of mine, an Austin guy, and he's helped me start my podcast. But he's got a lot of really good thoughts on this. We've had long conversations about that. But yeah, the misalignment that comes from adding an extra third party, and then how content is transformed to attract, like to support the advertisement, let alone the fact that the principal agent problem of like the advertiser is willing to auction your attention for meaningfully less, like orders of magnitude less than you value your own attention. But because of that sort of psychological barrier of like, oh, it's free, you allow it, even though if you know your attention is worth a cent a minute, an advertiser will sell it for a fraction of that. Yeah, it's a very interesting problem. But yeah, the interesting thing to me about this stuff like this Web3 YouTube, like it feels inevitable to me that something like this will replace or take a lot of market share from something like existing YouTube. But when is like the most important question, right? And I think there's probably some math to do there, and you could come up with a reasonable hypothesis that it's kind of like, well, there's 10 million wallets, but maybe only 3 million users, and there's not a big enough niche like commonality among those 3 million users, and you'd need, the right time to start that company is actually somewhere around 50 million users and 100 million wallets. Like it'd be interesting to go back and trace sort of this timeline of events of the Web 1 and Web 2 overlaid with the adoption of the internet itself. And you could do the same with mobile and see like at what user scale of the total internet or total like bandwidth distribution did eBay take off, or Google, or like YouTube, or Flickr, or all of these things, and come up with a little bit of a hypothesis for how it will play out in Web3.
All right, because we have a bunch of these, I'm gonna go to the next one because we could talk about Web3 YouTube as like an entire episode. So Crypto Gusto is really interesting. I like have one project right now where I'm working with a crypto group and I get paid in crypto for that project. And it's a mess. Like this whole payroll, like crypto payroll thing, there's no good solution right now that I'm aware of, at least. Maybe there is, but at least this company is not using it.
Like this is an obvious enough problem that there's a lot of people tackling it or building for it or whatever. DAO tools, like I've seen jokes about how there are now more DAO tool companies than there are DAOs. So it's potentially a little overdone. And I don't know how that's going to unfold. It is a problem that needs to be solved. And there's a lot of different niche versions of it too, right? Like how you do it for core contributors versus how you do it for bug bounties versus how you handle impression mining or marketing budget or sponsorship payouts is all interesting and maybe end up being like totally different companies. A really interesting sort of reframe. I think Naval, this is a Navalism though, I don't think it made it in the book, is that a company is basically just at its simplest a nexus of contracts. And so there's all of these different agreements and if thens and splits and payouts and vendor relationships and customer relationships and employee payouts and marketing spend and hosting bills to pay. And that if you map those things out and you slowly start to kind of examine those relationships one to one, the routing of all of those may end up all becoming blockchainified over time and be more and more driven by smart contracts, which is a very interesting thing. And it may not be, the ADP of Web3 might be 50 different companies that handle very specific payouts. And even, it's not like ADP handles all of the money within a company. There are already a ton of different vendors that handle a ton of different payouts in different directions. But looking at that nexus and then looking at specific use cases as beachheads, I think is a really interesting way to kind of approach the problem.
Yeah, that makes sense. There's like different, it's almost like the whole like job to be done framework, right? It's like instead of like ADP might be doing 20 things and maybe those 20 things can all be separate companies potentially or different services. Maybe some of them have to be bundled, maybe some of them don't. Okay, I love this next one. Personalized nutrition and health. Stitch Fix for my love handles. This is how a fund site needs to be done in the future. I feel like the personalized nutrition thing, obviously there's a lot of people who've gone after it. I haven't seen it done super well. I don't think. I think there's things that work for different people. I'm not saying there's nothing that works. There's obviously things that work. I just haven't seen like the killer one that's like everyone is going all after this. There was like the whole like there's the meal plan type companies which have been around forever. It's just DTC versions of that. But I think there's something here that, and I think this is where you're going with it, but I want to make sure that's true before I fully dive into that, is combining like the info you might get from like a wearable, like an Aura ring or something like that with nutrition and kind of building this whole kind of, I hate this word, but holistic view of the person.
Yeah, that's the big picture is I think that there's a unclosed feedback loop between the things that you can now know about yourself. Like I wear a Whoop fitness tracker almost all the time. I haven't played with the levels like blood glucose monitoring thing, but I should. There's now like at home blood tests. There's just all kinds of things that you can know about yourself, starting from as basic as your weight on a daily basis, all the way up to, your blood glucose level on a minute to minute basis or your genetics. And those are very high friction, let's say. Like you have to do all the hard work to basically turn that into inputs for yourself. First to parse and say like, oh, I had whiskey last night. I feel terrible today. My Whoop says I feel terrible today. This is the third time this has happened with whiskey. I'm going to stop drinking whiskey. Versus, oh, like I actually have a really hard time, processing vitamin D unless I get, unless I consume it in the form of green bell peppers. Like, everybody has these like weird personalized genetic things, whether it's from your gut microbiome or genetics or whatever that affect. There is no blanket nutrition advice aside from stuff that is borderline poison for everybody. But even then, some people respond better or worse to different things. And the work to turn those insights into action on the other side of what you consume is overwhelming. And so I think there's a really interesting, like, you can sort of ladder up complexity starting from, hey, I have a Wi-Fi enabled scale that drives my, either my meal delivery service or my groceries, or even just outputs like a calorie and macro recommendation for the day on a very basic level. It's like, hey, your BMI is 32, your body fat percentage is 35. Like you should be in a calorie deficit. So here's how you do that for your size and weight. And, this is what we recommend, all the way up to have a blood glucose monitor who's like, knows that you had orange juice in your Instacart this week and your like blood sugar is off the charts. So we're going to move you to, tea instead, or recommend these other things. So I think like you'd have to be a little nuts to actually closing that loop with increasing complexity and specificity down all the way from weight up to micro vitamins. and like mixing like, hey, you know, there's like vague health advice like, hey, you should be eating turmeric. Like, why? Who should be eating turmeric? Are you actually like deficient of a specific thing that gives you, or did you like Gwyneth Paltrow just say turmeric is good for you? So all of those things like could be resolved, and totally like everyone that I pitch this to is like, yeah, but how many people are that crazy that they actually want to optimize to that level? And I'm like, I don't know, maybe not that many. Maybe it's only Olympic athletes that actually want to invest in like the maximum level of feedback loop. But there's a lot of great companies that started with a, you know, service for exclusively nuts people who want to truly maximize something, and you can learn a lot of things that make that cheaper and better for other people. It may also be relevant for the incredibly sick. You know, there's stories of people who have beaten cancer through like these very holistic methods by like eliminating, by eating super like vegan diets. And but it borders on voodoo when you hear those stories because you don't actually understand the biology involved, and you can't see the feedback loop. You just have to trust a slightly crazy person who says it's going to work. And it's hard to do that when a like doctor is telling you that that's crazy and that you should go get this chemotherapy instead, and that's what everybody does. So yeah, I think there's a lot to unpack there, and the personalization. Like, we now have the infrastructure to handle the personalization of all that data and to collect it relatively cheaply, and there's just like great value in that hasn't yet been realized. And I'm doing a terrible job of giving you shorter answers on a per topic basis.
No, this one is real. This is like a really deep and interesting one too, because it's like I feel like on the personalized nutrition front and health front, the data is out. Like, there is data for all this stuff, provided you wear, let's say you wear the tracker, you know, you go to the doc, like there, you know, you can get your blood test. All this data exists. It's just very siloed everywhere. And it doesn't talk to each other. There's no sort of like recommendation engine or, you know, I mean, again, this is another word I don't like, but like smart thing that's telling you, hey, yeah, your whoop said this, your last blood test said this was in your Instacart. We think this is the better decision for you, for you. And you're right. There probably aren't that many crazy people who would do all of that right now. But I think the next question, and I think this applies to Web3 also. This is something that just I keep coming back to. It's come up in all 3 episodes I've done, 4 episodes I've done so far. So I feel like it's becoming a theme. Is like the on ramps. So this is not even Web3 related. This is on the personalized health thing. The on ramps for like a regular person to start using something, it just kind of has to be easy. And I think like Whoop and Aura, like they've done a really good job with this health tracker being easy kind of thing compared to other things I've seen in the past.
Even Apple Fitness, you know, would be plenty. Like, Apple Fitness would know, hey, like, you walked a long time yesterday. Maybe you, like, I don't know, went to the zoo or were in New York or whatever. Like, you should dial up the carbs and the proteins relative to fats tomorrow in order to kind of maximize recovery. Like, those are all really interesting things that could very easily, you know, you could feed macro requirements into your Uber Eats order or something like that. Like, so much is getting automated on the delivery side, and there's so much more structured data than there used to be in grocery and meal and calories that you can close that loop much easier than, you know, if we can use big data to to drive like recommendations in Stitch Fix, we should be able to do it for our own personal physical health. It's a harder problem for sure, but it is important and wide ranging and gives us the benefit of learning all of these things and seeing how different we all are and running a giant, you know, health laboratory sort of in real time all around the world.
Okay, so we could, again, that could be a whole episode. We we may have to do that at some point. But space is the next one. So the way I'm understanding you guys talking about space is like you got SpaceX, you got all these other companies that are trying to make space more accessible. What's like the next layer that comes off of that basic capability? Am I understanding that correct?
Yeah,
Correctly?
I think you know,
Yeah. Okay.
if space is a platform that's newly accessible, there's a bunch of use cases that weren't possible before that are now, and people smarter than me are going to figure out stuff to do with that. Like, Planet Labs is probably the first example of like, they're like, oh, we can get stuff up into space. Cool, let's real time image the whole surface of the Earth or take a photo of the whole Earth every day, which gets close to some of these like sci-fi tropes, like you know, the Earth program in Snow Crash that was like real time Google Maps slash Google Earth, and it was like the Marauders map for the whole planet constantly, like, which is crazy, but not that, but possible now, right? Like totally within the bounds of physics and current technological know-how. Do we want that? Like maybe, maybe not, but it's possible to get closer to that now. And yeah, I mean, Varda is like doing. I don't know if they're actually doing it yet, but they're tackling space manufacturing. Like, there's things that'll be easier to do or grow or build in zero gravity, and that's pretty rad. And there's probably 10 or 100 more things that I haven't even heard of yet because the smart entrepreneur has to teach it to me. But when there's a new platform, a new frontier that's newly economically accessible, like almost invariably, a ton of new opportunities and use cases arise. And also, it's just fucking cool. Like, space is awesome and badass, and I am not above saying that I invest in things that I find to be cool. Like, that is definitely a part of the thesis.
Yep. Anyone who was a nerd growing up, it's like that's the ultimate thing, right? Like, there's nothing cooler than space. It's like to be able to have a space company in your portfolio would just be like the coolest thing ever.
Yeah, and to be honest, it's like a decent indicator of like what of what is going to work or what is going to be interesting.
Yeah, that's for sure true too. I feel like there are a lot more companies that I've seen lately which are like that next layer of what's possible if space is accessible. I don't know if there's a lot, but I just feel like I've been coming across more than I ever did before, which was probably zero before.
Yeah, and the other thing I would say on space is that there is also a whole huge supply chain getting created on the back end. So it is not just like what can you do with the new platform. It is how do we support a very quickly growing space industry that is going to need new software, new tooling, new manufacturing, different parts and different materials at a new pace. Like all of that. I grew up in Detroit, so I am familiar with just how big a like supporting economy of a supply chain of an industry is. And if space becomes its own auto industry scale thing, there is just unbelievable depth and niche of opportunity. Like, the economy is just so mind-bogglingly big, and there are huge, huge, huge companies that do things that you would never even think of, 3 and 4 niches down into a supply chain like that.
Yeah, it becomes this full industry, not just, here's this one company. It's this whole industry that has to support that and everything that goes into it.
Yeah, the same thing is going to happen in nuclear, right? Like the needs of a nuclear power plant are so different than the needs of a coal power plant or an oil refinery. They need new software, new tooling, new parts, new supply chain, new safety protocols, new PPE, new everything is different, and that whole supply chain can shift over, and that is a huge opportunity for an entirely new supply chain and supporting infrastructure industry to take over from some of the oil and gas and fossil fuel supply chain that exists today.
So what makes you because this was the next one on my list too. What makes you so bullish on nuclear? Like, what's the sort of base case bullish scenario for nuclear?
I may be like a dreamy-eyed optimist at the fact that like the superior technology will eventually win. I think over the long arc of history, that's true, though it can take a distressingly long time for it to be there. People have a very the main bulk of the population, I think, is wildly misinformed for historical reasons when it comes to nuclear. Like, nuclear is way safer, way cleaner, way cheaper, and just like less dangerous to society than most people think. Like, when you talk about the Fukushima nuclear disaster, people are like, "Oh God, we can't have another Fukushima." It's like, well, what was Fukushima? And they're like, "Nuclear power plant blew up." It's like, sort of. A tsunami and an earthquake hit Japan, and many, many, many people died, like tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands. And a nuclear power plant happened to also be hit, and it did explode a little bit, but like a few dozen people were mildly injured and one died from radiation. So is that a reason to not pursue nuclear power that could be like orders of magnitude cheaper and less dangerous? And there's a political reasons why nuclear might come to the forefront. We found new materials like thorium to run nuclear on instead of uranium, which is way less likely to be. It's less volatile. It's way more common, so it's not as difficult to get as uranium. It doesn't get weaponized. It doesn't have nearly as much nuclear waste byproduct. So a lot of the common or initial concerns about nuclear are moot now. It's still very expensive, but that's mostly due to regulation and the fact that we're redesigning each power plant from the ground up instead of just getting a blueprint and printing a shitload of them, and creating
So we're
them.
not getting any leverage there.
Yeah, no leverage. Yeah, so there's a lot of, but there's also like a lot of people coming around to the fact that like maybe there's some negative byproducts to burning all the fossil fuels that we have, and there are some entrenched interests that are trying to convince us that that's a good idea, even though it's not. If you're concerned about climate change, the best thing to do is stop burning oil and coal and gas and start doing nuclear energy. In addition to renewables, that's great, but like nuclear is the only thing that's going to get us farther out in space than chemical fuels can possibly take us. A lot of new exciting things become possible there. Nuclear can get reinforced with nanotech and create these kind of like in the 50s and 60s, scientists were predicting, or sci-fi authors in particular, even technical well-informed ones, were predicting that like by 2020, appliances wouldn't have cords and we wouldn't have to charge things anymore because we'd have a nuclear battery built into everything that needed energy that was just able to last tens or hundreds of years. And that's not even a possibility that most people consider. We've made close to zero progress on like that scale of things. People have forgotten that that's actually like should be the goal. So there's a lot to do on nuclear. Again, as you say a few times, that could be a whole episode, and it has been. Like that's the podcast that I just did today was with the author of that book that came out. That is where I learned all of this stuff in like the last month. I was a fucking idiot about nuclear. I still am. I mean, I'm at the dangerous point of like I've been reading about it for 3 months, and I sound like I know what I'm talking about, but I really don't. But there's enough people who believe with decades of education who believe that this should be the future, that I tend to believe them, and all the reasons that all of the cons are quickly eroding or weren't cons to begin with. They were just sort of activist claptrap from people who think that we shouldn't have more energy, which is equivalent to just thinking that people should stay in poverty and live in this zero-sum, highly contentious, dangerous scrabble for resources, which is pretty fucked up, in my opinion.
Yeah, no, it's the Malthusiast, basically Malthusian view on humanity, and it's like more energy doesn't mean more pollution necessarily. Like it doesn't mean more like worse climate change or more CO2 emissions. Like that's the current paradigm, but doesn't mean we can't get beyond that. One thing I wanted before we skip off from nuclear, one thing I did want to talk about was like it almost feels like from what you said that there's a marketing problem with it. Like when you say different types of energy, right? Even like fossil fuels, right? You picture like a smokestack or something. I don't know. That's what I picture. Solar panels, right? I picture solar panels. Wind, I picture a windmill. Like hydroelectric, I picture like the Hoover Dam, right? And then you say the word nuclear and you picture like a mushroom cloud. And it's just like, I wonder if there's like, and you shouldn't, right? Because that's not true. I mean, it's not what a nuclear power plant does. Even if it did explode, I don't think it would be in like the shape of a mushroom cloud necessarily. It'd be more like a leak or something like that. But yeah, I don't know. Like it's like almost a marketing problem, it feels like. And that's to the average person. So there's almost like, as you said, I think a lot of the costs here are regulatory. On your site, you say what did you say exactly? You said lower than American regulatory overhead. Is there like a particular region you guys would be looking at more closely than like what places are doing this well is probably my real question.
So there's going to be people with a better answer to this. I believe like Germany and Eastern Europe are working on this quite intentionally. What's interesting and that I just learned is that like Bill Gates tried to do this and America was like, no, like try to fund a lot of nuclear energy research and America wouldn't let him. And so he went to China and was like, hey, I'd like to do this and America won't let me. Can I do it here? And they were like, sure. And America was like, how about no, you can't do that either. And so what I realized is that like America projects their own what they think should happen. It's like because like nuclear energy is equated with nuclear weapons, and there's some overlap, but not in technology. But it's not like if you have a nuclear power plant, you can create an atomic bomb. Like those are not equivalent things. but America still kind of like polices and regulates the technology development in territories that aren't theirs through other means, which is not great because the whole history of technology is sort of like when a thousand flowers bloom and a bunch of different experiments are run in this sort of decentralized way where everybody's kind of trying different things and tinkering in their garage. New ideas are tried and the right idea comes forth, and this sort of like meritocracy of technology and distribution takes over. But when something is as expensive and high overhead and dangerous as nuclear, you don't have that dynamic nearly as much. And if you don't have centralized, even a bunch of different centralized actors, it'd be one thing if 20 different countries were even trying to run their own programs, but with high intent and big funding. But even that's not really happening. So I think there's like a dangerous thing happening where there's like central control by an entity that that isn't as aggressively pursuing it as they could. The atomic bomb happened. There was basically 3 countries all trying to build atomic bombs as quickly as they could to win a World War II, and America happened to do it first. There was no guarantee that that was going to work and that we were going to be first, but there was massive, massive interest because you didn't want to die or lose the war in being the first to do that. And there's just nowhere near the urgency to accelerate the development of, nuclear power or nanotech or any of these things that there was around that, though.
There's no like Manhattan Project.
Yeah, there is no Manhattan Project for nuclear energy, though there should be, and we should all want that because it would be such an enormous source of abundance for us and lifting people out of poverty and enabling all these new technologies. There's so many innovations that are constrained by the lack of cheap energy that we just don't think about.
I just spent like a little over a week in Arizona, and like that part of the world, lack of water is such a big thing. But water is everywhere. But if you had cheap energy, you could use desalination, right? Like that's an energy dependent thing, and we don't do it as much as we would because it costs a ton of energy to do that, and it's just not economical. There's no water shortage in the world. I mean, most of the world is water. We just don't have the ability from an energy perspective to turn that into usable water.
Yeah, that's economics, not technology. And cheaper energy means abundant water. And if, scarce fresh water is the main thing that we are worried about in the coming 100 years, if you listen to, Michael Burry or anybody in California, that trickles down to agriculture and how expensive our food is going to be. And like, there is just so much downstream of cheap energy that I have very little patience or understanding for anybody who is implicitly or explicitly anti energy innovation and cheaper energy and more energy. That is not a view I can find much sympathy with, though it is quite common. So yeah, I don't know. I struggle with that a little bit, but yeah, I'm here to hold the flag and like let's join the charge. Come on.
Yeah, no, I think the energy innovation thing is just like it's definitely a marketing problem in more ways than one. That's just like it almost feels like to be a pro environmentalist, you have to be anti energy in many ways, unless it's renewable energy. But yeah, it's like it's hard to find I mean, not saying there aren't people. There's a lot of people who probably also know that more energy equals cheaper food, cheaper everything, and less poverty. I'm not saying that's like an uncommon viewpoint either, but it's kind of scarily common to believe that energy is bad. Like more energy is a bad thing.
Yeah, that it's more. I think more people are concerned about climate change and efficient use of existing energy than they are about improving the abundance and cost and economics of energy. My joke is always like, if our parents spent as much time yelling at us to turn off the lights as they did working on actually building and funding nuclear power, like we wouldn't have to worry about turning on the lights. We could leave all the lights on forever because it would be basically free. But yeah, I think that's totally right. Like marketing problem, desire problem, lack of understanding how all the dominoes fit together is important.
The good news is it does seem like people are talking about this finally, and it's becoming a little bit more mainstream. And then I think the other thing is the problem is becoming more and more acute where it's just needed. So hopefully that drives something too. So next two, I know relatively little about, so I'll probably spend most of the time being quiet for once. nanotechnology and quantum computing. I know almost nothing about either one, but they both sound super cool.
Yeah, nanotech. I'm especially fired up about right now because I just finished this book. Where's My Flying Car? This is also where I learned all the nuclear stuff. So Josh Storrs Hall is this, like, he spent his career in AI and nanotech, and wrote this book that's basically like a lot of the stuff that we've been talking about, in basically forecasting and hoping and dreaming of the next industrial revolution, which is this combination of nuclear energy and nanotechnology and AI. So if these three technologies sort of move apace, they are each mutually reinforcing and have the potential to really to move like human comfort and productivity and accomplishments a whole nother order of magnitude, or maybe two. And in our lifetimes, we can see things that are just gobsmackingly impossible to consider happening today, in the same way that prior to the previous industrial revolution, our life expectancy was less than half. We had no steel, no internal combustion engines. We were making no use of oil or gas. We had certainly no flight, no railroads. Like, it is very difficult for us to appreciate just how, like, short and scary and dangerous lives were before the Industrial Revolution, and uncomfortable. No electricity, no plumbing at scale, no, I don't know, the list goes on. So this next version of Industrial Revolution could really enable, like, basically entire flying cities. It could enable something like travel over the speed of sound, something approaching much cheaper or trivially expensive, like interplanetary travel, energy too cheap to meter, nanotech that meant that we could build towers out of diamond and launch things into space at like negligible cost. So nanotechnology is basically the simplest version. It's the ability to treat individual atoms like building blocks. So Lego atoms are our Legos, and we can build any material that we want. So creating a tower out of diamond is no more difficult than creating a bowl of fruit out of the raw materials that you have, which a lot of which we can get from either the ground or the air. It's functionally the end of scarcity in the physical world. And nuclear is the only energy source cheap enough to power that. And nanotech helps us do nuclear at a much cheaper and faster way and at a smaller scale, so that we can have these like little nuclear batteries and smaller nuclear power plants. And like basically Iron Man, let's just say like Iron Man becomes real with both nuclear and nanotech. And we need AI to help us like develop both of those technologies, is like how that next thing can unfold. But all of the other stuff that comes with that become really cool. Don't take my word for this. Like, please go read the book written by the actual expert and get all of the appropriate like parameters and constraints and caveats. Because like I said, I'm like a dangerous level of new to this and no deep technical education. I was surprised to learn from Josh that there's more progress in nanotech than there is progress in nuclear. That like the path to that is actually a little more clear. Yeah, even though I think it's farther from like it's farther from my mind and probably like talked about less often. Nanotech, really, really exciting and interesting, especially in sort of the end case where we can just build whatever we want basically instantly.
Yeah, I mean, going back to like enabling technologies, I mean, that's another one where like if that is possible on a real world scale, I mean, the kinds of things that could enable, it's just like I don't think you can grasp, or at least I can't grasp right now, all the possibilities that would actually create. It's like in our mind, right? It's like, oh, building that, it costs something. So it's like the mental math you do is like, is that worth it? But if it doesn't really cost anything, that completely changed. It's almost like an irrational number or something. Like it doesn't make sense initially.
We have stuff we treat like this now, right? Like bandwidth is basically too cheap to meter. We're not thinking about the fact that, we're both on live video and recording. We pay a flat rate, whatever, 50, 70 bucks a month for internet. And then we just consume all we want with no thought for the marginal cost. That is basically what energy could be like with appropriately built nuclear. It is also what physical things could be like with nanotech. And that is a way bigger leap to make. it is something that when you wrap your head around is like, what could possibly be more important than making that happen sooner, right? Like that would help people live longer. That would help them stay healthy. That would be the end of starvation in the same way that, as you mentioned, like abundant energy is the end of, any constraint around fresh water. Yeah. If energy is cheap, then transportation is cheap, then the logistics problem around distributing food and medical resources, become trivial. One of the examples in the book for nanotech is that you might have a device that is like the size of your phone with a vitamin pill in it or something that is like a bunch of rare atoms that you couldn't synthesize from the air that might become necessary. And when the formulation for hypothetically a vaccine, for just hypothetically a pandemic, is complete, that formula can get updated to everyone's like little printy iPhone, and it can synthesize the dose of the vaccine, and you could administer it at home, at scale, instantly, and physical things could get distributed that in that way. That like, even if you thought about 3D printing a lot, you still kind of think like, oh, I'll have to have a 3D printer. You don't think like, oh, something the size of my phone could synthesize a pill from the air, from and like molecules within it would have an effect on whether I lived. And this is back to personalized nutrition. Like you could do the same thing every day to augment your vitamin intake based on what you happened to eat the day before or what you happened to do the day before. So all of these things kind of there's not a lot of new problems, but the appearance of new technologies constantly sort of keeps us on our toes for what existing problems we can solve in new and more permanent or more precise ways.
Yeah, these are all these different areas. I need to read this book, by the way, that you keep mentioning. It's Where's My Flying
Yeah.
Car?
Yep. Where's My Flying Car?
I need to listen to the episode too. I think that came out today, right?
Yeah, the interview with the author came out today. I did a solo cast a little bit episode or two ago with just some of my favorite highlights and concepts from the book. So like the book it's not super technical, but it is like written by a scientist. So it's not a beach read in a weekend, but it is really fun and impactful and really like gets your mind going. But yeah, if you want a gateway drug, like those two episodes are designed to like inspire you, educate a little bit, but mostly inspire you to like commit to and go all the way through the book. And it truly, when I closed that book, I was like, this is going to change how I allocate my effort and prioritize how I invest and change how I think about what is important in terms of technology. Most of our careers, we've been just in this digital revolution, and software and computers are basically the only things that have gotten better in our lifetimes, or the primary source of innovation. Energy has basically flatlined, like, which means it's gotten no cheaper per capita. We haven't gotten more energy per capita. And that's why when you see these some of these like sci-fi shows or episodes where like basically nothing changes except the quality of the phone. I think like Parks and Rec did an episode that was like in 10 years in the future, and everything was exactly the same about the entire set, except everybody had these like fancy holograph phones. And I was like, oh shit, like that is exactly what's happening. Moore's law is the only thing that is like still progressing, and our software is getting better. But imagine if you had the exact same iPhone for the next 50 years. Like, how disappointing would that be, and terrible, especially after seeing the progress that we have made so far. Every fucking year, Tim Cook gets on stage and he's like, guess what? It's faster and thinner and more cameras and the software is better and we made everything in your life better. You're welcome. And nowhere else is that happening. Like, we don't see somebody doing that in nuclear. Elon Musk is now doing that with cars. Thank God. But like, or in space. But that's not going to affect most of us on a daily basis yet. But progress in all of these other areas is possible if we want it and we push it and we prioritize it. And for hundreds of years, the energy use per capita and energy cost per capita was going down. 300 years. And then in the 70s, it just stopped. And we have to, if we want like safety and abundance and even like positive relations with our neighbors and other countries, like we have to get energy in particular, but other physical innovations like back on pace.
Yeah, energy is kind of like the foundational one, right? Because I feel like it would affect food. It would affect, I mean, we talked about water already, but it affects so much that scarcity of energy would be it already does lead to wars. It leads to poverty for sure, because we all use it, right? So if the price of that is high, it's going to eat into everybody's budget. It's one of like the worst things to have a scarcity of. I mean, it's like energy, food, water, and shelter are probably, like the four things that
And
you just
if
need.
you
Like they're just baseline.
Yeah, and if you think about, I mean, this is not a well-considered opinion and it's well outside my circle of competence, but if you think about the main conflicts and disasters of the last, I don't know, 30 years, it's kind of like, well, Russia's invading Ukraine. Why? Like, because they have a shitload of oil. Russia invaded, or America invaded Iraq, ostensibly for reasons other than oil, but maybe because they had a lot of oil. We're enabling like some atrocities in Saudi Arabia because of the oil that they have there. Like there's a lot of that. I mean, the oil spills in the Gulfs and tankers, like that happened. Like there's so much that happens because of energy, and we are not even getting anything great out of it. It's just trying to keep our heads above water and not move backwards. So that's why I think like renewables are great, but like it is very difficult to get ahead of this without nuclear. And that does become just very, very important.
Okay, so there's a few more, but in the interest of time, if you're listening to this and you want to go and read the rest of the ones, I'm going to have the link in the show notes. I think everybody actually should go to their website, the rolling.fun website, and just read it because it's a fun read. But I did want to spend a couple minutes on Balmanac. So I didn't know until I was researching for this episode, like doing a little, I was like, oh, I know Eric. So I'll like research will be quick. And then I started diving in and I was like, what the hell is Balmanac? So I hadn't even seen any, I don't know if you've tweeted about it, but I didn't even know you were working on this.
Oh yeah, I've been like, I don't know, kind of quiet about it, but it's very it is in the exact same spirit of the Navalmanac. And actually, like, after the Navalmanac came out, Biology reached out and was like, hey, if you're interested in doing this, I've collected a bunch of materials. I feel like I could potentially benefit from some organization and synthesis. And I was like, yep, probably. You have a lot of really, really fascinating ideas that are difficult to access and sort of tangled up in contemporary events. And so, yeah, I have been working now for almost 2 years on sort of synthesizing and curating and organizing like the evergreen wisdom from biology. And Biology Srinivasan is also futurist, investor, founder, PhD, I think, in clinical genomics. Something, I think I have that wrong. He's a PhD in something very smart and has like founded a few companies. One was a clinical genomics company which sold for almost $400 million. He started Earn.com, which got bought by Coinbase. And then he was the CTO of Coinbase for a while. He just wrote a book called The Network State. He was early to call sort of COVID, and he's been in crypto for a very long time. He's just a fascinating guy with a very unique sort of perspective on the world and the future, and a successful track record as a founder and an investor. And I think he's just got really, really interesting ideas that a lot of people could benefit from absorbing in the same way that Naval did. So, and people seem to really love the format for the Navalmanac. And I've been amazed with the sort of the impact that that's had. And given the opportunity, I was like, yeah, let's do it again. So I want to say I'm coming down the home stretch on the manuscript, but I can never be quite sure. And so I'm working on it and learning a ton doing it. And it's actually been a really beautiful sort of synthesis with starting this fund and investing, because I literally see, I spend, the morning studying biology and trying to put some of these ideas in order and swimming around in his thoughts. And then I look at some companies in the afternoon and I'm like, oh, this pattern matches exactly the sort of very well articulated vision of the future that biology dropped and the historical sort of technologies that he talked about developing and the pace of really high in that. And like, this comes together wonderfully. So yeah, let's make this investment. And actually, I think in part because of that and our shared vision for the future, Biology is an investor in the fund, which is about the highest compliment I could ask for, which is super cool. So yeah, I'm proud to be allocating a small amount of his capital and getting into some of these companies that are going to, I think, meaningfully move us towards this future that, this brighter future, and solve a lot of these problems that we've been talking about.
I'm definitely going to look forward to that one. Maybe we'll do another Made You Think with Balmanac. Is there any kind of release date yet, or are you not it's too early?
It's too early. That'd be dangerous. I have one that I want, but and this is a battle that I have of like, I want to get it out and in people's hands eagerly, but I also know like maybe the most important lesson I learned from the Navalmanac is like craftsmanship requires an infinite timeline. And if you want something really, really, really high quality, you You cannot rush and you cannot compromise in the face of a deadline. You just have to give it the time and attention that it deserves. And that moving the goalposts on yourself is almost a necessary component to like getting something that is truly great and evergreen and an incredible reader experience and super valuable. And that frankly, the returns on that are like really important. Like you want something that is so good that people read it and love it and wish it was longer and recommend it to their friends. And that is so critical. So I'm going to respectfully withhold a timeline and just tell myself to put a little extra turn in it and make sure that it's great by the time it's out, and keep working on it. I spent all morning working on it. It is getting attention and care and love, and it's moving, but I want to make sure it's great.
I mean, Balaji is actually one of the best follow-up people, I think, to do from going from Navalmanak, because it's like he's very similar in that his ideas are, he's actually more technical, I would say, than Naval, at least in my own opinion. I don't know if that's true, but just from his tweets, he seems more technical. So I wonder if like the material that you're working with is harder to sift through.
It's more technical. Yeah, he's a little less pithy than Naval is, and he spends a lot more time actually talking about sort of contemporary events. So there's a lot more to sift through in that sense of like what are the really evergreen ideas here that are going to serve truly anybody who picks up this book, be useful to them.
All right, this episode has been awesome, Eric. Where can people find you? What should they go look at? Obviously, you have a podcast, and then obviously go buy Navalmanak. That's out. I've read it. It's awesome. Did 2 podcast episodes on it, not just one. Did 2 full episodes on Navalmanak. So make sure you go buy that. But Eric, where can people find you online?
Everything that I do, you can find from ejorgenson.com. I spend a lot of time on Twitter as well. So that's probably the easiest place to get a hold of me. But all the podcasts, the blog posts, the book, the fund are all linked from ejorgenson.com. Yeah, it's a wide range of projects, but you'll find something interesting or useful there, I hope, for everybody.
Yes, there's the course, there's the podcast, there's the book, there's the fund, all sorts of stuff.
Yeah, it's been awesome to be here, and this is a very fun conversation, and it's good to dig into some of these things that just fun projections on the world. I appreciate you having me.
This is awesome. Hopefully we'll eat a sandwich together soon. For anybody who doesn't know, Eric has this epic thread going on Twitter of just his sandwiches that he eats. I don't even know how many are on there now, but it's long. That's a long thread.
Dozens. I've been at this for years. Yeah, it's like either stupid commentary or none at all. I'm glad you contextualized that, because I think it's like the 3rd sandwich drop inside joke we've had. But
I need to throw something in the intro for that. That's what people. Otherwise, no one's gonna get it.
They'll figure it out. Welcome to the inside joke. Yeah.
All right. Well, Eric, this was awesome. Would love to have you back on at some point. But go follow Eric. Go read his book and invest in his fund if you want.